Hey, it's True here, and I want to make a video on the differences between what appears to be some of the most popular personality models, at least when it comes to the MBTI world. The main ones I see are the MBTI itself, the Grantian or so-called function stacks model, a more Jungian model, and also the objective personality model. I'm not including sociology because that seems like that's just something completely different, even more different than these. So what exactly are these and how should they be seen? I want to note here that this is just my opinion, my thoughts on these models. It's not fact, don't take it as fact. It's no more than just my thoughts and my feelings about these models. The MBTI should be seen as the dichotomy and no more than the dichotomy. It should be interpreted exclusively as being made up of 4 separate false dichotomy pairs, which are introversion and extroversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving. The MBTI has completely different interpretations of the functions and attitudes as well when compared to other models, and the way it is applied is the most subjective approach, in my opinion. You take a test, but you can simply request your type to be changed to whatever you want. At the end of the day, the MBTI is about you typing yourself, regardless of what the MBTI instructor thinks or feels. They can be overridden, making the MBTI purely subjective. The way the MBTI applies the perceiving and judging dichotomy has no scientific credibility at all. The MBTI uses the P and J to assume a person's extroverted side. The MBTI does this due to a major misunderstanding of Jung's work, in my opinion, which has led to the entirely unsupported by evidence idea that a person has a dominant function that is supported by an auxiliary function that is in the opposite attitude to the dominant. This means, for example, the MBTI assumes for no credible reason that someone with extroverted sensing as their dominant function has an introverted thinking or feeling as their auxiliary or secondary function. This isn't supported by Jung, and it's also not supported by any actual research or studies at all. The MBTI should be seen exclusively as a dichotomy model for best results, in my opinion. And if you look at it that way, then it actually has about 50 to 60 years worth of studies and research behind it, but it only supports the dichotomy. Onto the so-called function stacks model then. The function stacks are absolutely horrendous. Really, they have no support at all of their existence. They cannot be measured. They were basically made up by Harold Grant and his friends in a book called From Image to Likeness, A Jungian Path and the Gospel Journey, and the ideas suggested aren't supported by the MBTI or Jung's model. This function stacks model, which could be referred to as a Grantian model, posits that people have a function stack made up of our functions that fall in opposite directions, from dominant to inferior. For example, someone with a dominant extroverted sensation would have an auxiliary or secondary introverted thinking or feeling. This so far is the same as the also not credible MBTI functions approach, but it alters at the tertiary or third function. In the Grantian stack, the tertiary is then of the opposing attitude to the auxiliary, meaning the third function in this stack would be extroverted, then the inferior would be introverted. It creates an EIEI or IEIE stack that looks good on paper and has inspired some truly bizarre and ridiculous ideas, such as the cognitive functions loop, which I'll get to later. But it isn't consistent with Myers and the MBTI's model. The MBTI actually assumes the tertiary would be in the same direction as the auxiliary and inferior functions, creating an IEEE and EIII stack. And it's inconsistent with Jung's model, where the stacks would look like IIEE and EEII, in my opinion, according to my own understanding of his work, which makes the most sense to me, but it also has no scientific credibility. The Grantian function stacks model should be completely scrapped and thrown in the junk pile as far as I'm concerned, because it just makes no sense at all, and it doesn't have any evidence to support any of the theories that relate to it. I understand it's arguably the most appealing model, which is why it's so popular, but it's just straight up crap and inconsistent with everything else. Then we get to a more Jungian approach, which is actually very different to both of the MBTI approach and the Grantian function stacks that I've gone through so far, for a multitude of reasons, but I'll just stick to a couple that stand out for me. For starters, there's no judging and perceiving dichotomy. Jung had ideas that were somewhat similar, but absolutely not the same. These were referred to as rational and irrational functions. A rational function means the functions were within the realm of reason. This includes thinking and feeling. Irrational functions simply meant functions that were not within the realm of reason. Instead, these are better understood as facts, or things that simply exist without explanation or without requiring any explanation or thought to understand. These would be intuition and sensation. They're perceptions that are simply just there, beyond reason. So we can see that Jung's rational functions are very different to the supposed MBTI counterpart in judging, where it's about wanting things settled or decided. It's a completely different thing and it shouldn't be compared. We can also see Jung's irrational functions are completely different to the MBTI's perceiving functions, which are about wanting to remain open to new information, essentially. There are a few similarities between Jung's rational functions and the MBTI's judging dichotomy, and there are some similarities between Jung's irrational functions and the MBTI's perceiving dichotomy, but nowhere near enough to consider the two as being the same thing. So that's major difference number one. The next difference is that from a Jungian perspective, introversion and extroversion just don't exist on their own. There would simply be no introversion and extroversion dichotomy. The whole IE dichotomy wouldn't exist. The attitudes exist through the function, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, which means the foundations of these two models are vastly different. Following that, it means that from a Jungian perspective, there would be extroverted types and introverted types, not extroverts and introverts in and of themselves. Following Jung's model, there'd be 8 main types, although he was open to the existence of more. These would be the extroverted sensation, extroverted intuitive, extroverted feeling, and extroverted thinking types on the extroverted side. And on the introverted side, there'd be introverted intuitives, introverted sensation, introverted feeling, and introverted thinking types. The next difference is that Jung believed the secondary function would be of the same attitude to the dominant function, as far as I understand it, and he believed the tertiary function was a pair for the inferior function. This would actually create an IIEE stack for introverts and an EEII stack for extroverts. So you can see his model is completely different to the MBTI and the Grantian model. The next one then, well, the last one that I'll be talking about in this video is the objective personality model, which is basically just made up. There's lots of flaws with the way that they're going about testing their theories, but at least they're trying, and that's something they've got over the Grantian model. Objective personality has definitions of functions, etc., that aren't consistent with other models, and in my opinion, they should just change the names of everything and be something new and different. They strive to test whether Jung's functions, etc., are real or testable, but they do it using their own definitions of his functions, which means that they're not actually testing his functions or his definitions of the functions at all. Objective personality believes that both the Jungian IIEE and EEII stack and the Grantian EIEI and IEIE stack are credible or real, and the way they attempt to justify this is by way of what they claim to be jumper types. These jumper types are complete nonsense because jumper implies someone is jumping over, and they use this terminology themselves, one function in favor of another. They end up with types that require some serious mental gymnastics to justify, and for reasons I can't understand, they still use the MBTI's dichotomy to refer to the types. So you can get things like an ESFP that actually prefers their extroverted thinking over their introverted feeling. I mean, if this is the case, I'd love it if objective personality could just not pretend the person is an F anything and instead put the preferred T into the person's type. The same goes for everything else. It's just a mess. Jumping makes it sound like someone is skipping over a stronger function for a weaker one or something. It's a misleading term, and the way it's applied is confusing, as in their model, yes, someone that literally prefers thinking over feeling can come and say that they're an ESFP, for example. It just makes no sense. That person would be an ESTP, and you know it, it's simple logic. Let's just cut the crap. Props to them for trying though, and they're really the only ones that are actually trying to do anything remotely innovative at the moment. I just wish they'd stop using Jung's terms, because the model they've created is far enough removed from Jung that it'd be nice to see it just flourish and be its own thing. I don't want to go too much into detail here because I think it could be a little overwhelming, but here's the differences between the models when it comes to their function stacks. So the MBTI has an EIII and IEEE stack. The Grantian model has the EIEI and IEIE stacks. A Jungian perspective would be the EEII and IIEE stacks, and objective personality just kind of slaps everything together except for the MBTI's function stacks, even though they use the MBTI's dichotomy. And here's some differences between what the P and J dichotomy is and what Jung's rational and irrational functions are. P and J is about being open or closed to new information, wanting decisions to be settled versus wanting to keep your options open. It's that kind of thing. Everything about the P and J divide is along those lines. Rational and irrational on the other side. Well, the rational functions relate to functions that are bound by the laws of reason. Irrational functions relate to functions that are not bound by the laws of reason. These are completely different things. So you can't view the P and J dichotomy as being the same as Jung's rational and irrational functions, because it's completely different. Before I go, I'd like it if people could just take a little while to try and understand the ramifications of one thing in particular, and the massive impact that it's had on personality theory, at least when it comes to these models today. This is the cognitive functions loop. This was created by a guy called Simulated World on Personality Cafe back in 2010, and unfortunately it pretty much went viral throughout the community. It just doesn't exist from an MBTI perspective, and nor do these cognitive functions loops exist from a Jungian perspective. They're only a possibility from a Grantian perspective, and the Grantian model is the one with the least credibility. The MBTI's dichotomy has about 50 to 60 years of research behind it, and Jung's model was made up of his own research that he came up with over many years, although his theories can't really be tested. The Grantian model has nothing, it has no support. If you read his book, it's just anecdotal and nonsense. It's the least credible, and yet its function stack is the one that somehow achieved the most popularity. It's crazy. They also don't exist as a mental problem the way that they're outlined in Simulated World's post about them in the objective personality model either, as these function loops would be made up of the same foundations as their jumper types. So there is a model of personality along these lines that's using the exact same pairings of functions that Simulated World has posited as these sort of function loops, and he's likened them to various sorts of mental illness and disabilities. There's a model that's using these same pairs, but in a way that just defines the type. They're calling them jumper types. I have issues with that I've already covered, but they're not talking about these jumper types as mental illness and all kinds of, the Simulated World post goes on about schizophrenia, and it's just absolute nonsense. Hopefully this video helps tell some of these models apart from one another. Something to keep in mind is none of these models are compatible with the others. They're all entirely different, and it's more likely that you're a different type in each model if you're actually honest with yourself than it is that you'd be the same type in each model. To be the same type in each model, you simply have to be doing some extreme mental gymnastics and being highly selective about what parts of the models you're accepting and what parts of the models you're not accepting of. Please remember this is all just my subjective opinion. That's it from me. Turi over and out. If you want to see more content like this, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and also let me know in the comments section if there's anything else you might want me to talk about. I'll see you later.